Hi everyone, my name is John, and I'm presenting on Johnston's Radical Behaviorism for ABA Practitioners, Chapter 8, Ethics, Rights, and Values Without the Heat. And this is a review. Here we go. So the introduction. The chapter begins with a scenario that makes the reader think about structure and culture associated with service providers. The idea that I got after reading this scenario was a rationale of choice, values, and culture with the government, service providers, and those that are being served. I would like to hear about what you thought on the scenario. So the next section breaks down ethics and ethical communities. It breaks down the meaning of ethics, ethical behaviors, social contingencies, ethical standards, and ethical communities. Ethics is described in this section as contingencies sanctioned by a community that addresses how we behave. It is categorized by the behavioral practices within a community. Therefore, ethical behavior is concerned with how we influence each other's behavior. The social contingencies are the building blocks for ethical standards that are expressed as rules for behavior. Ethical standards also concern behaviors that has indirect effect on us. The book described animal cruelty as a violation of ethical standards. My example of this section is applied behavior community are concerned with scientific methods for improving socially relevant behaviors, opposed to the criminal justice community, which is concerned with punishing behaviors that are deemed unacceptable by law. And to me, in many ways, these two communities indirectly affect one another. Social contingencies of a community as a whole deems behavior that are acceptable and not acceptable. And the behavior analysis community seeks to provide evidence for improvement, while the criminal justice community seeks to punish behaviors regardless of if it's social or not. This section, what are rights and where do rights come from? I kind of combine these topics because they're so closely related, so it's kind of like pairing them. The title of this section in the book had a little 2 next to the title. And at the bottom of the page, it stated that this discussion is based on Vargas' 1975. So I did a little research and I found a book named Contemporary Issues in Behavior Therapy, Improving the Human Condition. And this book described Vargas's perspective of ethical communities. It states that, examined with a behaviorological perspective, the problem of poverty is functionally a problem of competing macro contingencies, arrangements when making them. Vargas claims that rights, that is, emitting behavior in the form of right statements, concerns the use of oneself, others, or things to obtain reinforcement or avoid punishment. I also describe what macro contingencies are because I didn't really know. So it's an examination of some of the concept used in the behavioral analysis of cultural phenomena, such as that macro contingencies may not differ substantially from group of contingencies. Vargas also stated in this book that invariably claiming a right questions who does or doesn't have that right. So my connection to that statement is the information on protected class and the Reconstruction Amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that gave protection to former slaves. Right statements begin with individuals. However, ethical communities define and sanction the individual rights. The book connects learning behavior repertoires in the ethical community of growth. This includes verbal behavior about rights. Statements and other actions concerning rights are fully controlled by ethical communities. The chapter identifies that ethical communities are where support for our rights are found. The next section, values. What are values? Are values beyond science? This section addresses values as having similar characteristics of rights in the sense that they are not physical entities and have some sort of mental existence. Values are described as behavior or the behaviors of others in different environmental circumstances. Rights and values intersect at morally acceptable or desired actions within communities, focusing on preferred ways of behaving. They imply a reinforcing state of affairs. So they also have similarities from a behavior analytic perspective in the sense that they are associated with reinforcers. The distinction between rights and values are not always obvious in daily discussions. Science as a notion of evidence, observation, and systemic structure cannot resolve question values in common argument. Approaching value as a verbal behavior implies otherwise. The applied behavior perspective can suggest that good produces reinforcers and bad produces punishers. The book describes interpreting values into behavioral terms greatly alleviates the scientific task of acknowledging value and suggests that suggestions for individuals and society. However, in the respect of to science, the research question must be determined to assist in addressing values. The emotional tone of cultural values may suggest that settling this disagreement is impossible. Another factor that supports that notion is that cultural values are always changing, and one can say that is due to evolution. The fact that it is argued that science cannot assist in addressing the argument of values implies that values are something other than behavior, or that behavior itself is beyond scientific understanding. And something that I found disappointing after this section was that it ended on the note that there is no good example at this topic. By viewing values as learned behaviors makes this kind of approach practical. So now I'm going to double back on the box information. Box 8.1, Behavior Analysis and Religious Behavior. This section addresses familiar values associated with religion. It is described that many grew up in households where religion played an influential role. Conceptualizing that this is a scientific perspective can be acknowledged as an operant behavior learned from our verbal communities. The tact of our behavior is that verbal behavior learned through contingencies arranged by others. Religious belief is no different from this notion. The book states that believing something is true does not necessarily mean that it is. Behavior analytics view religious behavior and belief should remain consistent in the perspective that is an operant behavior originated from our reinforcement history. The next section, questioning religious behavior, box 8.2 suggests that the key is to examine this aspect of our lives as religious behavior rather than a special aspect of human nature. This topic in this section questions how religious behavior in all of its form originates and how it influences a person's life. The answer stands within the framework of scientific and philosophy of behavior analysis and examine aspects of a person's repertoire. A curious aspect of religious behavior concerns the behavioral nature of religious faith. It is viewed as a subset of general matters of the meaning to have a belief. Some view religious faith as a special or different to other beliefs. I interpret it as that I can believe in God, but I also believe in my capabilities, and I assume that it carries different properties of conception. But with the scientific approach set aside traditional properties and look for physical processes to explain behavior. The behavior analytic perspective does not address the content of meaning of our behavior in its everyday sense when considering religious behavior and religious faith. It should be framed in the context of operant learning processes. The explanation of religious faith requires consideration of more than verbal behavior. Some aspects involve emotions or feelings intermixed with how we are taught to tact them. My conception of this entire section is that religious behavior and belief are a delicate topic. However, the behavior analytic seeks to understand this concept through conceptualizing it as a learning behavior. Therefore, therefore it makes observing religious behavior and belief researchable. The last section, taking the heat out of the argument, addresses the heated conflict around these topics. It addresses some key elements of having an agreement that values statements of our verbal behaviors, laying groundwork, offering preliminary premises that will likely be accepted before the difficult ones, get a consensus, communicate on the topics such as verbal communities and repertoires, discussion of value-based issues and stuff like that. Once the foundation is set, keep the focus on behavioral features and remain alert to the inevitable mentalistic backslide, which I thought was a funny word to describe this because backslide is typically used in religious settings. Figuring out the agenda and interpretation, where these interpretations come from, and discovering an agenda. In discovering your agenda, you are trying to convince others, or is there a comprehensive interpretation of behavioral science? One point in this section I found valuable is the fact that the book points out that you can have an opinion, but the conversation should be addressed in the same way that you're asking others to. And lastly, focusing the conversation on the kinds of evidence may be useful in resolving this issue. These are the references that I used to develop this presentation. And here are my questions to the class. So I have 4 questions here, and I just want you to pick one of them. What did the scenario at the beginning of the chapter make you think of? The next question are, what are your perspective on religious belief and behavior and science as a science? So more specific, do you believe that research can be conducted completely free of unbiased or beliefs? The hint to that question is found on slides 6 and 7. Behavior analysis and religious behavior and questioning religious behavior. The next question are there any specific ethical communities that influence your educational path? Ethics and ethical communities are found on slide 3. And more specifically, with that question, I want to know a little bit about, did you have a certain repertoire coming up that definitely made an impact in your life that made you select applied behavior as your career field? The last question is, are there any issues or conflict of rights that are particularly important to you in applied behavior analysis, and why? So with this question, I want to know, do you think that the people that you serve should have specific rights, or do you think that they should have a value implemented into their repertoire that sort of, that should be afforded to them? And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for watching.